So we're here today with Qing Cao, a professor at Durham University. His work focuses on Western conceptions and representations of China, alongside sort of discursive constructions within China of concepts such as national self-identity and modernity. We're going to have a discussion today about sort of rhetoric in global politics and Western conceptions and representations of China. So in the first set of questions, we're going to talk about sort of global rhetoric and representations of China. So going through sort of your past work around specifically analysing BBC documentaries of China, you argued that there'd been a rhetorical shift around China from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era. So you talk about sort of the rhetoric and framing of China going from being a rediscovery of China in the 1980s to being a repulsion of political China in the 1990s. We'd just really like to get your thoughts, and if you think we're entering a new framework now, sort of in current politics, or maybe the last 5 years, around representations of China.
Okay. So I didn't hear the last part of your question, the last sentence.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. I was just, if you think we're entering a new sort of framework of representation of China, there's new conceptions from the sort of rediscovery you talked of in the 1980s, or the repulsion that followed that, just if you think we're entering a new phase where sort of representations have become more fixed from the post-Cold War era.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I will start from the last maybe a few decades, maybe after the Cold War. China has started to take a very different image, starting from the 1990s. So in the 80s, the image was, let's say, broadly positive, and then after Tiananmen in 1989, and the image changed to a very negative period, so for about a decade, and I'll talk about that. And then I think from 2001, the image started to change from negative to what I would call an age of uncertainty. So I think we have witnessed that uncertainty for about 20 years, so 2 decades. So for these 2 decades, for United States, the UK, they had a very difficult time to define the nature of China. So the overall image is very mixed because they have lost the parameter to define China. But now I think we have entered perhaps a new age. I call it the age of hostility. Okay, broadly, of course, a lot of different shades of images within the broader camp in the West. For example, the United States is going to be different from the UK, but let's talk about the United States. The United States is going to start a new phase in terms of American-China relations. Now, we are already in the first preparation stage of that particular age, the age of hostility. Okay, I'm saying this because there are clear indications, because over the past 20 years, the United States have come up with various definitions of the nature of China. For example, responsible stakeholders, one of them, strategic competitors. But now, so the United States started to see China as an adversary. So that is the change of the nature from a mixed understanding of China to a more definitive understanding of China, adversary. Okay, it's not official, of course, but that is what is taking shape at the moment. So this is, let's say, geopolitics but also is going to shape up the mass media, because the mass media really follow the political rhetoric rather than having an independent assessment of a country like China. Okay, so because you have questions about from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, and do you think that we are entering a new framework of geopolitics? And I will say yes, we are at the very beginning stage of this framework of hostility in terms of U.S.-China relation, but not British-China relation, because British-China relation is going to be very much affected, but it's not going to be of the same nature as U.S.-China relation.
Thank you. The second question that we had relates quite a bit to the first, so I'm sorry if you covered it already. So we were going to ask, what do you think about the rhetoric around the emergence of a new Cold War or decoupling? Do you think that the instability that characterized Western conceptions of China in the post-Cold War have swung towards being negative?
Yes. Now, I start the last question first. So, talking about Western conceptions of China, has that swung towards being negative? I will say yes, in terms of U.S.-China relation, but I would say now the Western broad image of China has been mixed, but more on the side of being negative. But negative is not a huge problem because in Western reporting of, let's say, the non-West are broadly negative anyway, in all ages. But I think the issue here is whether China is seen as an enemy, as a adversary. I think this is the what is really important to watch for. And I think United States has started to have China being seen in the mass media as a adversarial power, not necessarily in the UK. Okay. But Western is very broad, is not precise. For example, there is a European perspective. For example, Germany and France, they see China differently from the United States and also different from the UK. So you have broadly in the Western countries a difference between the Anglo-Saxon countries, medias, the Five Eyes countries, but also you have the European positions, perspectives, attitudes, which are different because they are much more neutral in seeing the current strategic contest between United States and China. Now, in terms of decoupling, I think this is one of the surest indication of we are sliding into the Cold War. The slide has already started, okay? Because I see it at two levels. One level is the definition of the nature of your relationship with China. I'm talking about the United States, and then eventually perhaps the UK. UK is going to be defined by ambiguity. It has been the case in the past 2 decades. I think perhaps at the moment it's going to be very ambiguous. In the next few years, it's going to be ambiguous. But the UK has there's a lot of pressure from the United States on the UK. So the first level is policy, is defining the nature of the relationship. The second level is what do you do? What do you follow up in your practice? I think decoupling is vital here. I think this is more important than rhetoric, because rhetoric can shift. Decoupling is going to affect the nature of the relationships in the next at least 1 decade, because once you have started the process, in the next few years, United States is going to move away from China. They are going to have the real decoupling policy, which is going to affect other countries. I don't think the UK is going to follow too closely with the United States, but to some extent, UK will do something in that area.
Thank you for that. That's a really interesting point, and I think the differences you definitely make around the West being a very broad category, and I think we noticed that when we included it in the questions, that you do get very stark differences between the USA and other Anglo-Saxon countries and the Five Eyes, like you mentioned, and European countries. To sort of follow that up, we're going to drill a bit deeper into specifically British conceptions and representations of China in our second section of questions. So the first one around specifically Britain would be, is that how has the British rhetoric around China shifted from the so-called golden age of Sino-British relations under David Cameron, Xi Jinping's state visit and things like that? How has that shifted? Have we seen events like choosing to use Huawei in the 5G? And even recently, I've read an article around Project Defend, and it talked about reducing UK's dependence on imports from China. So it'd be really interesting to get your opinion on that.
Okay. Now, in terms of the UK's, let's say there are two questions here, as I understand. Okay, one is the broadly how media see China. One is the political rhetoric, including the nature of foreign policies on China. Now, the Golden Age is an example for me, is the UK's government's ambiguity about British-China relations, UK-China relations, because the relations has not been entirely stable, because sometimes the UK is more critical about China and sometimes it's more friendly. When you say friendly, it's really business relations, okay? But also Hong Kong is an issue which has impacted upon political relations to some extent. But Hong Kong is not going to define British foreign policies about China, because that is something that the UK government has been very careful to manage. Now, the Golden Age is really about political relations. It's nothing beyond that. So it's quite, I will say, superficial to some extent. I think that is going to change. Now, the Huawei, the 5G, for example, it's very clear that the UK do not have a huge problem with Huawei and 5G. It's the pressure from the United States, which has been a major factor in making the decisions, because British intelligence is one of the best in the world. If they find any evidence that Huawei 5G is going to pose real security threat, they wouldn't cooperate with Huawei at all. So there's no talk about whether we want to do 5G with China or not. Okay, So it's really the pressure from the United States which has been a issue here. But I think my sense is that UK is going to move away from 5G in the next few years, because all of this is a strategic decision. It's not going to take a few days, a few months. It's going to take years ahead. So one decision made today is going to affect at least the next 3, 5, 10 years. So if you decide to move away, you don't hear anything, but something is going to be done, and then that is going to have real consequences in real life in many years to come.
Okay, thank you. That's quite an interesting point. If I could just follow up with a question, it'd be interesting to you say that the UK is still sort of defined by some sort of ambiguity towards China. Do you think that is there sort of growing political pressure though in places like Parliament? I know that, for instance, over the whole entire decision to implement Huawei in the 5G network, it ended up being a political scandal, and Gavin Williamson was sacked. So do you think there is starting to be a more negative image of China and conceptions in sort of the UK political bodies?
I think the general shift is going to be more negative, because I think that one of the major issue is America rather than the UK. If you take America out of the equation, and then the UK is going to have a difference. I'm not going to say fundamental difference, but it's going to have a different policy towards China. It's going to be much more positive. It's going to be warmer, and it's going to be more constructive relations, but based on trade mainly. But with the factor of United States, Britain's relation with United States, I think in foreign policy, the UK is going to distance from China. So the distance is going to grow, okay? And also the mass media. Again, I think the mass media is going to be very ambiguous. So this trend is going to continue. I don't know for how long, but it's going to be moving towards more negative. It's going to be more political reporting, but it's not going to have a dramatic increase, because the UK and China doesn't have a real strategic clash, which is fundamentally different from United States, because the United States see China starting with a strategic competitor to now a adversarial power. But the UK doesn't see it in that way. The UK see China as a country which share a very different political culture, but also seeing China as a business partner, a very important business partner for the post-Brexit UK future, in particular economic future. So I think the UK will be finding it difficult to manage the different factors coming into play in the decision in terms of how to deal with China. I think the real issue is to define the nature of, let's say, UK-China relation. I don't think the British government has a very clear definition on that. So different politicians will have the different views, and the different groups of politicians have different views, but there's no consensus. This is different from the United States. United States currently in the political class, the consensus is very clear, which is different from the UK. Anyone who is in the position of the Prime Minister in the UK has to manage UK-China relations very, very carefully.
Okay, thank you. In our last question, we want to talk more about your work, about UK UK media perceptions of China. So, especially in relation to your work, do you think there's been a change in how China is portrayed in documentaries and TV in the UK, particularly over the last 5 years?
Right. I haven't followed very, very closely on all the documentaries produced in the British television. However, I think that the general pattern has not changed, which is so after the 1990s, which is the an age of negative reporting of China. And then starting from the beginning of the 21st century, we're talking about the last 2 decades. I think the general series of reporting on China is gone. So broadly, China is not dominant, is not as important in, let's say, television reporting. There has been much less documentaries about China than the previous age, the 1990s. The reason being that it's very difficult to, again, coming back to the same issue of what type of image you want to portray to the British public. What story about China are you going to tell, to the general public? That parameter is gone because no one has had a very clear definition of the nature of UK-China relations in the past two decades. But before that, at each age, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, the parameter is very clear. And if you have read one of my articles about 11 ages, historical ages, it's only the last age, what I would call the age of unpredictability or uncertainty, is that you don't know how to define it, and therefore you don't want to do anything seriously about it because you don't do something that you do not have a very clear view about it. I think that trend is going to continue in the future. I don't think there's going to be a lot of China reporting in the mass media. What is interesting is 20 years ago, very few people went to China for a visit. They don't have a knowledge about China, so they really rely on the media. But now a lot of people travel to China, and a lot of people have personal experiences. But at the same time, China has broadly disappeared from the British media, disappeared from the British television. And that is going to continue in my sense, in my view of the broad reporting landscape. I don't think that's going to change very quickly. So we'll see large absence of China in the British media.